Sarah Martinez had always been drawn to the ocean. Growing up in a small coastal town in California, she spent her childhood watching the waves crash against the rocky shore, dreaming of adventures beyond the horizon. At 25, she worked as a marine biologist at the local research station, studying dolphin behavior patterns along the Pacific coast. Her days were filled with boat trips, underwater observations, and endless hours of data analysis. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, Sarah was preparing for what seemed like a routine research expedition. The weather forecast showed calm seas and clear skies, perfect conditions for tracking the pod of bottlenose dolphins that had been frequenting the area for the past 3 weeks. She loaded her equipment onto the research vessel, checking her underwater cameras, GPS tracking devices, and diving gear twice, as was her habit. The boat's captain, Miguel Rodriguez, had been working with the research station for over 15 years. He knew these waters like the back of his weathered hands, every current and every hidden reef. As they headed out to sea, Miguel noticed something unusual on his radar display. There was a small blip about 2 miles northeast of their planned observation point, moving erratically in the water. Sarah was busy calibrating her equipment when Miguel called her attention to the radar. The blip appeared to be a small vessel, possibly in distress. Maritime law and basic human decency demanded they investigate. Sarah agreed without hesitation, her research mission temporarily forgotten as they changed course toward the mysterious signal. As they approached the coordinates, they could see a small military inflatable boat bobbing dangerously in the increasingly rough waters. The weather had changed unexpectedly, as it often did along this stretch of coast. What had been calm seas an hour earlier were now churning with 3-foot swells, and dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. In the inflatable boat, they could make out a single figure in military fatigues, slumped over and apparently unconscious. Miguel maneuvered their research vessel as close as safely possible, while Sarah grabbed the rescue equipment. The man in the boat appeared to be a young Marine, his uniform soaked and his face pale against the gray morning light. Sarah quickly assessed the situation. The Marine's boat was taking on water, and he was clearly in medical distress. Without waiting for Miguel to secure their position, she dove into the choppy water, her years of ocean experience guiding her through the dangerous currents. The cold Pacific water shocked her system, but she pushed through, swimming with determined strokes toward the sinking boat. When she reached the inflatable vessel, Sarah could see that the Marine was barely conscious, mumbling incoherently and showing signs of severe dehydration and possible hypothermia. His name tag read Thompson, and he couldn't have been more than 22 years old. His lips were blue and his breathing was shallow and irregular. Working quickly, Sarah managed to secure a rescue line around Thompson's chest, signaling to Miguel to begin pulling them both back to the research vessel. The process was treacherous, with waves constantly threatening to separate them and pull the unconscious Marine under. Sarah used every ounce of her strength to keep Thompson's head above water, as Miguel slowly hauled them both to safety. Once aboard their boat, Sarah immediately began first aid procedures. She checked Thompson's pulse, which was weak but steady, and began warming him with emergency blankets while monitoring his breathing. Miguel radioed the Coast Guard, providing their coordinates and requesting immediate medical evacuation. Thompson drifted in and out of consciousness during the 20-minute wait for the rescue helicopter. When he was lucid, he kept repeating something about a training exercise gone wrong, about being separated from his unit during a night navigation drill. Sarah stayed by his side, talking to him to keep him conscious and reassuring him that help was on the way. The Coast Guard helicopter arrived with its characteristic thunder of rotor blades, lowering a rescue basket to extract Thompson. As the paramedics prepared him for transport, he grabbed Sarah's hand weakly and whispered, "Thank you." His eyes, though glazed with exhaustion, held a clarity that told her he understood she had saved his life. After the helicopter disappeared toward the mainland hospital, Sarah and Miguel returned to shore. The adrenaline that had carried her through the rescue began to fade, replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion she hadn't expected. Miguel noticed her growing pallor and suggested she see a doctor, but Sarah dismissed his concerns, attributing her fatigue to the physical demands of the rescue. Back at the research station, Sarah tried to focus on her work, but she found herself feeling increasingly dizzy and disoriented. Her supervisor, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, noticed Sarah's condition and insisted she go home early. Sarah drove herself back to her small apartment overlooking the harbor, thinking a good night's sleep would restore her energy. But sleep didn't come easily. Sarah tossed and turned, her mind replaying the morning's events. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Thompson's face pale and desperate in the churning water. She wondered how he was doing, whether he had recovered from his ordeal. The rescue had been successful, but something about the young Marine's condition had troubled her more than she initially realized. Around midnight, Sarah finally drifted off to sleep, unaware that her body was fighting its own battle. The stress of the rescue, combined with her extended exposure to the cold Pacific water, had triggered a severe physiological response. Her immune system, already compromised by long hours and poor eating habits, began to shut down as her body temperature regulation became increasingly unstable. What Sarah didn't know was that Marine Corporal James Thompson was not just any service member. He was part of an elite reconnaissance unit based at nearby Camp Pendleton, and his rescue would set in motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. As she slept fitfully in her small apartment, Thompson was recovering in the base hospital, telling his commanding officers about the brave woman who had risked her life to save his. The next morning, Sarah woke up feeling worse than she had the night before. Her head pounded with the intensity that made it difficult to focus, and her body ached as if she had been hit by a truck. She attributed these symptoms to the physical strain of the rescue and decided to push through her discomfort. Getting ready for another day at the research station, Dr. Jennifer Walsh took one look at Sarah when she arrived at work and immediately sent her home. Sarah's skin had taken on a grayish pallor and she was clearly running a fever, despite Sarah's protests that she felt fine. Dr. Walsh was adamant that she seek medical attention immediately. At the local clinic, Dr. Robert Chen examined Sarah thoroughly. Her temperature was elevated at 102.3 degrees Fahrenheit. Her blood pressure was dangerously low, and she showed signs of severe dehydration, despite drinking plenty of fluids. Dr. Chen was concerned, enough to recommend immediate hospitalization. For further testing and observation, Sarah reluctantly agreed to stay overnight at the hospital. As she was being admitted, she had no idea that 40 miles away at Camp Pendleton, Corporal James Thompson was telling his story to anyone who would listen. Word of his rescue had spread quickly through the base, and Thompson's commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Hayes, had taken a personal interest in the case. Thompson described Sarah's heroic actions in vivid detail to Colonel Hayes and several other senior officers. He explained how she had jumped into dangerous waters without hesitation, how she had kept him conscious and calm during the rescue, and how her quick thinking had undoubtedly saved his life. The Marines were deeply moved by the story of a civilian who had risked everything to save one of their own. Colonel Hayes decided that Thompson's rescue deserved recognition. She began making inquiries about Sarah Martinez, learning about her work as a marine biologist and her reputation in the local community as someone who was always willing to help others. The colonel was particularly impressed when she learned that Sarah had previously participated in several volunteer coastal rescue operations. Meanwhile, Sarah's condition at the hospital continued to deteriorate. What the doctors initially thought was simple exhaustion and mild hypothermia was revealing itself to be something more serious. Blood tests showed elevated white blood cell counts and other markers indicating a severe systemic infection. Dr. Chen suspected that Sarah had contracted a rare bacterial infection, possibly from exposure to contaminated seawater during the rescue. The bacteria, later identified as Vibrio vulnificus, was particularly dangerous because it could cause rapid tissue death and septic shock, if not treated aggressively. Sarah's immune system, already weakened by stress and fatigue, was struggling to fight off the infection. By Thursday evening, her condition had become critical, and she was moved to the intensive care unit. Dr. Chen called Sarah's emergency contact. Her sister Maria, who lived 3 hours away in Los Angeles. Maria dropped everything and raced to the hospital, arriving to find Sarah unconscious and connected to multiple machines monitoring her vital signs. The doctors explained that Sarah was in septic shock and that the next 24 hours would be crucial for her survival. As Sarah fought for her life in the ICU, Colonel Hayes was putting together something unprecedented at Camp Pendleton. She had contacted Thompson's entire unit, explaining the situation and asking for volunteers to help honor the woman who had saved their fellow Marine. The response was overwhelming. Every single member of Thompson's reconnaissance unit volunteered, and word spread to other units on the base. Thompson himself was recovering well from his ordeal, but he was consumed with worry about Sarah. He had learned about her hospitalization through the base's investigation into his rescue, and he felt responsible for her condition. If he hadn't needed saving, Sarah would never have been exposed to the contaminated water that was now threatening her life. Colonel Hayes assured Thompson that what had happened to Sarah was not his fault, but she understood his desire to help. She began organizing what would become one of the most remarkable displays of military gratitude in recent memory. Hayes contacted Marine units throughout Southern California, sharing Sarah's story and asking for their participation in a tribute that would honor her sacrifice. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Marines from Camp Pendleton, Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, and even some stationed at 29 Palms volunteered to participate. Within 48 hours, Colonel Hayes had coordinated with over 500 Marines who wanted to pay their respects to the woman who had risked her life for one of their own. But Sarah remained unconscious, her condition fluctuating between stable and critical. The doctors had started her on powerful antibiotics and were using advanced life support measures to keep her organs functioning, while her body fought the infection. Maria maintained a constant vigil at her sister's bedside, holding her hand and talking to her, even though Sarah showed no signs of consciousness. Dr. Chen explained to Maria that patients in Sarah's condition sometimes could hear and understand what was happening around them, even when they appeared completely unresponsive. He encouraged Maria to continue talking to Sarah, sharing memories and letting her know that people were thinking about her and praying for her recovery. On Friday morning, Thompson appeared at the hospital, still weak from his own ordeal but determined to see Sarah. Maria initially hesitated to let him visit, unsure how seeing the person Sarah had risked her life to save might affect her emotionally. But Thompson was so earnest in his desire to thank Sarah personally that Maria eventually agreed to let him sit with her for a few minutes. Thompson sat beside Sarah's bed, holding her hand gently and speaking in quiet tones. He told her about the Marines who were coming to honor her, about how her bravery had inspired hundreds of service members who had never met her. He promised her that the Marine Corps would never forget what she had done, and that her sacrifice would be remembered and honored for years to come. As Thompson spoke, the monitors showed a slight change in Sarah's brain activity, though she remained unconscious. Dr. Chen noted the change in her charts but cautioned that it was too early to determine if it indicated improvement in her condition. The infection was still raging through her system, and her body was using every ounce of energy to fight for survival. Saturday morning brought both hope and concern to Sarah's medical team. Her vital signs had stabilized somewhat during the night, but she remained deeply unconscious, her body still fighting the aggressive bacterial infection that had invaded her system. Dr. Chen reviewed her latest blood work with cautious optimism, noting that some inflammatory markers were beginning to decrease, suggesting that the antibiotics were finally gaining ground against the infection. Maria had barely left her sister's side for 3 days, surviving on hospital coffee and the occasional sandwich brought by concerned colleagues from the research station. Dr. Walsh had visited twice, bringing flowers and updates about how the marine biology team was covering Sarah's research projects. The dolphin pod Sarah had been studying was still in the area, as if waiting for her return. What Maria didn't know was that outside the hospital, an extraordinary mobilization was taking place. Colonel Hayes had worked tirelessly to coordinate what she was calling Operation Gratitude, a tribute that would honor Sarah's heroic actions in a way that had never been attempted before. The logistical challenges were immense, but Hayes was determined to show Sarah and her family that the Marine Corps took care of those who took care of Marines. Transportation had been arranged for Marines from 3 different bases, with convoy routes planned to minimize disruption to civilian traffic. Hayes had coordinated with local law enforcement to ensure that the large gathering could take place safely and legally. The hospital administration had been briefed and had given their permission for the tribute, understanding the significance of what was being planned. Thompson, though still recovering, had become the unofficial coordinator of his unit's participation. He spent hours calling fellow Marines, sharing details about Sarah's rescue and the woman who had risked everything to save him. Each conversation resulted in another volunteer, another Marine who wanted to be part of honoring this remarkable civilian who embodied the values they had sworn to uphold. By Saturday afternoon, Marines were beginning to arrive at staging areas near the hospital. They came in dress blues, their uniforms immaculate and their bearing reflecting the gravity of the occasion. Senior non-commissioned officers ensured that every detail was perfect, from the alignment of ribbons to the shine of their shoes. This was not just a gathering. It was a ceremony honoring someone who had demonstrated courage that would make any Marine proud. Colonel Hayes visited the hospital Saturday evening to check on Sarah's condition and to brief Maria about what was being planned. She explained that hundreds of Marines wanted to pay their respects to Sarah and asked for Maria's permission to proceed with the tribute. Maria was overwhelmed by the gesture, hardly able to believe that so many service members would go to such lengths to honor her sister. Dr. Chen was initially concerned about the potential disruption to the hospital environment, but Colonel Hayes assured him that the Marines would conduct themselves with the utmost discipline and respect. She explained that this tribute was not just about honoring Sarah, but about demonstrating the values that Marines lived by: honor, courage, and commitment. Sarah had exemplified these values when she risked her life to save Thompson. As Saturday night turned into Sunday morning, Sarah's condition remained unchanged. She continued to breathe with the assistance of a ventilator, her body still and peaceful despite the war being waged within her cells. The infection had peaked, according to Dr. Chen, and the next few hours would determine whether her immune system could finally overcome the bacterial invaders. Thompson arrived at the hospital early Sunday morning, joining Maria in the vigil beside Sarah's bed. He had brought with him a small group of Marines from his reconnaissance unit, men and women who wanted to meet the family of the person who had saved their teammate. They spoke quietly with Maria, sharing stories about their own families and the dangerous work they did in service to their country. One of Thompson's fellow Marines, Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, had a background as a Navy corpsman before transferring to the Marines. She looked at Sarah's monitors with a trained eye, noting the subtle improvements in her vital signs that indicated her body was beginning to win its battle against the infection. She shared her observations with Maria, offering hope based on her medical training and experience. Outside the hospital, the gathering was beginning. Marines arrived in chartered buses, personal vehicles, and military transports, all converging on the medical center with a precision that reflected their military training. Colonel Hayes had designated specific areas for formation, ensuring that the tribute would be visible from Sarah's hospital room window, while not interfering with normal hospital operations. The local media had gotten wind of the gathering, and news crews were beginning to set up their equipment. Colonel Hayes had decided to allow limited media coverage, believing that Sarah's story deserved to be shared with the broader community. She wanted people to know about the civilian who had risked everything to save a Marine, and about the military community that never forgot such sacrifices. By mid-morning, nearly 400 Marines had assembled in the hospital parking area and surrounding grounds. They stood in perfect formation, their dress blue uniforms creating a sea of navy and red that stretched across the hospital grounds. The sight was both beautiful and moving, a testament to the bonds that connected these service members to anyone who demonstrated the courage and selflessness that defined their core values. Dr. Chen made rounds in Sarah's room, checking her responses and adjusting her medications. He noted that her pupils were beginning to react to light more consistently, and her brainwave patterns were showing increased activity. These were encouraging signs that suggested Sarah might be beginning to emerge from her unconscious state. Though it was still too early to predict when or if she would fully awaken, Maria noticed the change in activity outside the hospital window, but was too focused on her sister to pay much attention to what was happening in the parking area. Thompson, however, was keenly aware of what was taking place outside. He knew that his fellow Marines were gathering to honor Sarah, and he felt a deep sense of pride in being part of a military community that valued courage and sacrifice, regardless of whether it came from within their ranks. The hospital chaplain, Father Michael O'Brien, visited Sarah's room to offer prayers and comfort to her family. Maria, though not particularly religious, found solace in the chaplain's words and presence. Father O'Brien had seen many patients in critical condition during his years of service, and he sensed that Sarah was fighting her way back to consciousness with the same determination she had shown when diving into dangerous waters to save a stranger. As Sunday afternoon approached, the gathering outside reached its full magnitude. 500 Marines now stood in formation, creating one of the most remarkable displays of military respect ever assembled for a civilian. Their presence had drawn hundreds of onlookers, including many hospital staff members who were moved by the sight of so many service members coming together to honor one person's heroic actions. Sunday afternoon brought an almost electric tension to the hospital, as the 500 Marines stood in perfect formation outside. Inside Sarah's room, the atmosphere was equally charged, but for different reasons. Dr. Chen had noticed significant improvements in Sarah's neurological responses over the past few hours, and he was cautiously optimistic that she might be emerging from her unconscious state. Maria sat beside her sister's bed, holding Sarah's hand and speaking softly about the extraordinary gathering taking place outside. She described the rows of Marines in their dress blue uniforms, their solemn faces reflecting the gravity of their tribute. As she spoke, Maria thought she felt a slight pressure from Sarah's hand, so subtle that she wondered if she had imagined it. Thompson remained in the room with several members of his unit, all of them watching Sarah's monitors for any sign of improvement. They had become deeply invested in her recovery, feeling that her awakening would somehow complete the circle of heroism and gratitude that had brought them all together. Each slight change in her vital signs was noted and discussed in hushed tones. Colonel Hayes coordinated the final preparations for the tribute ceremony from a command post she had established in the hospital parking area. She had arranged for a public address system so that she could speak to the assembled Marines and explain the significance of their gathering. Local dignitaries, including the mayor and several city council members, had arrived to witness this unprecedented display of military appreciation. The hospital's chief administrator, Dr. Patricia Williams, was amazed by the discipline and organization of the Marine gathering. Despite the presence of 500 service members, there had been no disruption to hospital operations, no noise complaints, and no interference with patient care. The Marines had conducted themselves with a professionalism that impressed everyone who witnessed their tribute. As the afternoon sun reached its peak, Dr. Chen entered Sarah's room for another examination. He was struck by the changes he observed in her condition. Her breathing was stronger and more regular. Her color had improved significantly, and most importantly, her brain activity was showing patterns consistent with emerging consciousness. He performed a series of neurological tests, noting responses that had been absent just hours earlier. Maria watched anxiously as Dr. Chen conducted his examination. When he turned to her with a cautious smile, she felt a surge of hope that she had been afraid to allow herself to feel during the dark days of Sarah's illness. Dr. Chen explained that while Sarah was still unconscious, all indicators suggested that she was beginning to wake up from her medically induced coma-like state. Outside, Colonel Hayes began the tribute ceremony by explaining to the assembled Marines why they were there. She told them about Sarah Martinez, a marine biologist who had risked her life to save one of their own. She described Sarah's courage in diving into dangerous waters to rescue Corporal Thompson, and how that heroic act had resulted in her current fight for life in the hospital behind them. The Marines listened in absolute silence as Colonel Hayes spoke about the values that connected them to Sarah's actions. She explained that courage, honor, and commitment were not qualities exclusive to military service, but rather universal virtues that Sarah had demonstrated when she chose to act, rather than stand by while someone needed help. Her words resonated deeply with the assembled service members, many of whom had faced similar moments of decision in their own careers. Thompson had been asked to speak during the ceremony, and he stepped forward to address his fellow Marines. His voice was steady but emotional as he described the moments when Sarah had pulled him from his sinking boat, how she had kept him conscious and calm during the rescue, and how her quick thinking had undoubtedly saved his life. He spoke about the debt he felt he owed to this remarkable woman who was now fighting for her own life. As Thompson spoke, something extraordinary happened inside Sarah's hospital room. Her eyes began to flutter, and Dr. Chen immediately noticed the change in her consciousness level. He quickly moved to her bedside, speaking her name softly and asking her to squeeze his hand if she could hear him. Maria leaned forward, her heart racing as she watched for any sign that her sister was finally waking up. Sarah's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, but gradually gaining clarity. She tried to speak but found that the ventilator tube prevented her from making any sound. Dr. Chen quickly explained where she was and what had happened, reassuring her that she was safe and that her condition was improving. Sarah's eyes moved around the room, taking in the faces of the people gathered around her bed. The timing of Sarah's awakening seemed almost miraculous, occurring at the exact moment when 500 Marines were gathered outside her window to honor her heroic actions. Dr. Chen carefully removed the ventilator tube, allowing Sarah to breathe on her own for the first time in days. Her voice was weak and hoarse, but she managed to whisper her sister's name, bringing tears of joy to Maria's eyes. Thompson was still speaking to the assembled Marines when a nurse rushed outside to inform Colonel Hayes that Sarah had awakened. The news spread quickly through the formation, and a collective sense of relief and joy passed through the ranks of service members. Their tribute had taken on an even deeper meaning, knowing that the woman they were honoring was now conscious and aware of their presence. Dr. Chen carefully explained to Sarah what had happened during her unconscious period, how her body had fought off a severe bacterial infection, and how many people had been concerned about her recovery. Sarah listened with growing amazement as she learned about the extent of her illness and the outpouring of support from the military community. When Maria told Sarah about the 500 Marines gathered outside her window, Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. She struggled to sit up, wanting to see this extraordinary tribute for herself. Dr. Chen initially hesitated, concerned about her strength, but seeing the determination in Sarah's eyes, he helped adjust her bed so she could look out the window. The sight that greeted Sarah was unlike anything she had ever seen. 500 Marines stood in perfect formation, their dress blue uniforms creating a mosaic of blue and red that stretched across the hospital grounds. They stood at attention, their faces solemn and respectful, creating a tableau of military precision and honor that took Sarah's breath away. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she realized that all of these service members had come to honor her actions in rescuing Thompson. She had never considered herself a hero, had never thought that saving someone in distress was anything more than basic human decency. The magnitude of their tribute was overwhelming, and she struggled to comprehend why her actions had inspired such a response. Colonel Hayes, informed that Sarah was awake and looking out her window, made a decision that would create one of the most memorable moments in Marine Corps history. She gave a command that rippled through the formation, and 500 Marines simultaneously came to attention and rendered a slow, precise salute that lasted for exactly 60 seconds. The sight of so many hands raised in tribute to a civilian who had embodied their values was both powerful and deeply moving. Sarah watched through her tears as hundreds of Marines maintained their salute, understanding that this gesture represented something far greater than gratitude for a single rescue. It was recognition of the courage and selflessness that connected all people who chose to act when others needed help, regardless of their profession or background. The 60-second salute from 500 Marines created a moment of profound silence that seemed to suspend time itself. Sarah watched from her hospital window, tears streaming down her face as these service members maintained their tribute with military precision. The sight was so overwhelming that she had to lean back against her pillows, her newly awakened body not yet strong enough to process the emotional intensity of what she was witnessing. Dr. Chen monitored Sarah's vital signs carefully during this emotional moment, noting that while her heart rate had increased due to the excitement, her overall condition remained stable. He was amazed by her resilience, both in fighting off the infection and in handling the overwhelming realization of how many people had been affected by her heroic actions. As the salute concluded, Colonel Hayes approached the hospital entrance with Thompson and several senior Marines. They had requested permission to visit Sarah personally to deliver a message of gratitude from the entire Marine Corps community. Dr. Chen agreed to allow a brief visit, understanding that this meeting would be meaningful for both Sarah and the service members who had traveled so far to honor her. Maria helped Sarah prepare for the visit, brushing her hair and adjusting her hospital gown so she would feel more presentable. Sarah was still weak and her voice remained hoarse, but her eyes were bright with curiosity about meeting the people whose lives she had somehow touched through her simple act of courage when Colonel Hayes entered the room with Thompson and two other senior Marines. The atmosphere became charged with mutual respect and admiration. Sarah looked at Thompson with recognition, remembering his face from the rescue even though much of what followed remained a blur in her memory. Thompson approached her bedside with obvious emotion, struggling to find words adequate to express his gratitude. Colonel Hayes spoke first, introducing herself and explaining the extraordinary nature of the gathering outside. She told Sarah that in her 25 years of military service, she had never seen such a spontaneous outpouring of respect for a civilian. The Marines had come from 3 different bases, many using their own time and resources to participate in the tribute, all because they wanted to honor someone who embodied the values they held sacred. Thompson finally found his voice and began to tell Sarah how her rescue had saved not just his life, but his future. He explained that he was engaged to be married in 6 months, and that her actions had ensured he would be there to walk down the aisle with his fiancée. He spoke about his family, his dreams of becoming a career Marine, and how all of those possibilities existed because Sarah had been willing to risk her own safety for a stranger. Sarah listened with growing amazement as Thompson described the training exercise that had gone wrong, leaving him alone and disoriented in increasingly dangerous waters. She learned that his survival gear had malfunctioned, that hypothermia had been setting in, and that he might not have survived another hour without rescue. The realization that her quick decision had literally meant the difference between life and death for this young man was both humbling and overwhelming. One of the other Marines, Sergeant Major Robert Johnson, presented Sarah with a certificate of appreciation signed by the Commanding General of Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. The document recognized her extraordinary courage and selfless service in the rescue of a United States Marine and declared her an honorary friend of the Marine Corps. Sarah held the certificate with trembling hands, reading words that seemed to describe someone else entirely. Colonel Hayes then presented Sarah with something even more special, a Marine Corps flag that had been flown over Camp Pendleton specifically in her honor. She explained that this flag would always represent the bond between Sarah and the Marine Corps community, and that she would forever be considered part of the Marine family. The gesture moved Sarah to tears, as she understood the significance of being accepted into such a close-knit military community. As the visit continued, Sarah learned more about the individual Marines who had participated in the tribute. Many had their own stories of rescue and heroism, moments when they had risked their lives for fellow service members or civilians. They recognized in Sarah's actions the same selfless courage that defined their profession, and they wanted her to know that such bravery never went unnoticed or unappreciated. Dr. Chen eventually had to limit the visit time, concerned about Sarah's energy levels during her recovery. But before the Marines left, Thompson made a request that surprised everyone. He asked if Sarah would consider attending his wedding in 6 months, explaining that he and his fiancée wanted her to be part of their special day as an honored guest. Sarah was touched by the invitation and promised to do everything possible to attend. After the Marines departed, Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon processing everything that had happened. Maria helped her understand the timeline of events, explaining how her condition had deteriorated after the rescue, and how the Marine Corps community had mobilized to honor her actions. The story seemed almost too incredible to believe, yet the evidence was overwhelming. Hundreds of service members had cared enough to travel great distances just to pay their respects. The media coverage of the event began almost immediately, with local news stations reporting on the unprecedented tribute. The story of a marine biologist who had risked her life to save a Marine, and the 500 service members who had honored her courage, captured the attention of news outlets across the country. Sarah's heroic actions became a symbol of the civilian-military bond and the universal nature of courage and selflessness. Over the following days, Sarah received hundreds of cards, letters, and emails from people across the country who had been inspired by her story. Many were from military families who wanted to thank her for saving one of their own. Others came from civilians who were motivated by her example to consider how they might help others in their own communities. The research station where Sarah worked was inundated, with calls from people wanting to support her recovery and her marine biology research. Donations poured in from military units, veteran organizations, and private citizens who wanted to ensure that Sarah's important work could continue. Her dolphin research project received enough funding to expand its scope significantly, allowing her to pursue studies she had only dreamed of conducting. Thompson visited Sarah several times during her recovery, and they developed a friendship that went far beyond the circumstances of their first meeting. He told her about his training, his hopes for his military career, and his plans for marriage and family. Sarah shared her passion for marine biology, her love of the ocean, and her dreams of contributing to scientific understanding of marine ecosystems. As Sarah's strength returned over the following weeks, she began to understand the broader impact of her actions. The story had resonated with people because it demonstrated that heroism was not limited to those in uniform, that ordinary citizens could display extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it. Her rescue of Thompson had become a symbol of the values that connected all Americans, regardless of their profession or background. The Marine Corps officially invited Sarah to participate in several ceremonies and events, recognizing her as someone who embodied the service values of honor, courage, and commitment. She was asked to speak at military gatherings, sharing her story and inspiring others to consider how they might serve their communities. Sarah discovered that her experience had given her a platform to advocate for both marine conservation and the importance of civilian-military cooperation. 6 months later, Sarah found herself standing in a beautiful chapel at Camp Pendleton, wearing her best dress and holding a small bouquet of flowers as she prepared to fulfill her promise to attend Thompson's wedding. Her recovery had been complete, with no lasting effects from the bacterial infection that had nearly claimed her life. The months since her rescue had transformed her from a quiet marine biologist into an unexpected public figure whose story continued to inspire people across the country. Thompson looked handsome in his dress blue uniform as he waited at the altar for his bride Jessica to walk down the aisle. His family had flown in from Ohio, and many of his fellow Marines were in attendance, creating a sea of military uniforms in the chapel. But Thompson had insisted that Sarah sit in the front row, in a place of honor typically reserved for immediate family members. Jessica Martinez, soon to be Jessica Thompson, had insisted on meeting Sarah before the ceremony. The two women had bonded immediately over their shared experience of loving someone whose life had been touched by military service. Jessica thanked Sarah repeatedly for saving the man she loved, and Sarah was moved by the young woman's grace and genuine appreciation. The wedding ceremony was beautiful and deeply meaningful, with military traditions woven throughout the service. When the chaplain spoke about the bonds that connect people across different backgrounds and circumstances, he specifically mentioned how Sarah's heroic actions had brought together two families and created lasting friendships that transcended the original rescue. During the reception, Thompson stood to give a speech that moved everyone in attendance to tears. He spoke about the morning 6 months earlier when he had been alone and afraid in the Pacific Ocean, convinced that he was going to die far from everyone he loved. He described the moment when he saw Sarah diving into the dangerous water to save him, and how her courage had given him hope when all seemed lost. Thompson then turned to Sarah, who was seated at the head table with the wedding party. He told the assembled guests that Sarah represented everything good about the American spirit: the willingness to help strangers, the courage to act when others needed assistance, and the humility to downplay her own heroism. He announced that he and Jessica had established a scholarship fund in Sarah's name to support marine biology students who demonstrated both academic excellence and community service. Sarah was overwhelmed by this unexpected honor, rising to acknowledge the applause from the wedding guests. She spoke briefly about how the experience had changed her own life, teaching her that individual actions could have far-reaching consequences, and that courage was often simply the decision to do what was right regardless of personal risk. The evening included many emotional moments as Sarah met the families of other Marines who had participated in the tribute 6 months earlier. Parents, spouses, and children thanked her for her actions, explaining how her story had become a source of pride and inspiration within their military community. Many shared their own stories of sacrifice and service, creating connections that Sarah knew would last a lifetime. Colonel Hayes, who had coordinated the original tribute, was also in attendance at the wedding. She presented Sarah with another surprise: a commission as an honorary Marine Corps Reserve officer, complete with a ceremonial sword and a certificate signed by the Commandant of the Marine Corps. The honor was unprecedented for a civilian, But Hayes explained that Sarah's actions had earned her a permanent place in Marine Corps history. As the wedding celebration continued into the evening, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that September morning, when she had decided to investigate an unusual radar signal. What had begun as a routine research expedition had evolved into a life-changing experience that had connected her to a community she had never expected to join. The Dolphin Research Project that had been expanded with donations from the military community was yielding remarkable results. Sarah's team had made several significant discoveries about dolphin communication and behavior, findings that were contributing to broader understanding of marine intelligence and conservation needs. Her work was gaining international recognition, and she had been invited to present her research at conferences around the world. More importantly, Sarah had become an advocate for the values she had learned from her Marine Corps friends: service before self, courage in the face of danger, and commitment to something greater than individual interests. She spoke regularly at schools, community organizations, and military events, sharing her story and encouraging others to consider how they might serve their communities. The friendship between Sarah and Thompson had deepened over the months, with both of them recognizing that they had been forever changed by their brief but intense shared experience. Thompson had been promoted to sergeant and was thriving in his military career, while Sarah had found new purpose in her scientific work and her role as an unexpected spokesperson for civilian-military cooperation. As the wedding reception drew to a close, Sarah found herself standing outside the chapel looking up at the stars over Camp Pendleton. Thompson and Jessica joined her, and the three of them talked about their hopes for the future and their gratitude for the circumstances that had brought them together. Thompson told Sarah that he planned to make a career of the Marines, hoping to eventually become an officer and lead other young service members. Jessica spoke about her dreams of becoming a teacher and working with military families to help children cope with the challenges of military life. Sarah shared her vision of expanding her research to include collaboration with military environmental programs, using her marine biology expertise to support Naval and Marine Corps conservation efforts. The story that had begun with a desperate rescue in the Pacific Ocean had evolved into something much larger, a network of relationships and commitments that would continue to influence lives for years to come. Sarah's split-second decision to dive into dangerous waters had created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate rescue, touching hundreds of lives and inspiring countless others to consider their own capacity for courage and service. As Sarah drove home from the wedding that night, she thought about the young Marine who had been unconscious in her arms 6 months earlier and who had just married the love of his life surrounded by family and friends. She remembered the 500 Marines who had stood in perfect formation to honor her actions, and she understood that their tribute had been about much more than gratitude for a single rescue. The experience had taught her that heroism was not about seeking recognition or praise, but about being prepared to act when circumstances demanded courage. It was about recognizing that everyone had the capacity to make a difference in someone else's life, and that the connections formed through acts of service and sacrifice could create bonds stronger than any other human relationship. Sarah's story had become a reminder that the values of honor, courage, and commitment were not exclusive to military service, but were universal principles that could guide anyone willing to put others before themselves. Her rescue of Thompson had demonstrated that heroism could emerge from the most unexpected circumstances, and that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose to act, rather than stand aside. The marine biologist, who had simply been trying to study dolphins, had become a symbol of the civilian-military bond, proof that courage and compassion could bridge any gap between different communities and backgrounds. Her story would continue to inspire others for years to come, a testament to the power of individual action and the enduring strength of human connection.